What's up? I'm Delaney Fisher, and welcome to your Self-Helpless Snack, where I share a little taste of the Self-Helpless podcast with a mini episode. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, you can find the full episode linked in this episode's description.
When a child has grown up with parents who exhibit few or no boundaries in the way that they are in relationship with that child. And it can be traumatic in so many different ways, but one of the biggest ways that it is traumatic is how insidious it is, because the enmeshment growing up with a parent who doesn't have any boundaries or doesn't have appropriate boundaries with you can feel really special and really close. And at the same time, it can feel like this big burden and obligation to please a parent or show up for a parent. And so the trauma can manifest in many different ways for adult children who grew up with enmeshing parents. And we can get into some of those ways in a second. But I would say it's really insidious, and creates a huge distortion for a lot of adult children about the quality of the relationship that they had with their parent and who they are as a result of growing up this way. So there are a lot of identity fragments that can occur when someone has grown up with an enmeshed parent, because enmeshment essentially is the co-opting of a child's development in service of the parent's emotional needs. Ideally, a close relationship is one that is based on mutuality and interdependence. That's really difficult to achieve in a parent-young child dynamic because children are dependent on us for survival. So, what a healthy, close relationship looks like is recognizing that when children are young, it's kind of a one directional relationship. And that is the parents are holding space for and attuning to the needs of the children. And it is not expected that the children should take care of or anticipate or even understand the needs of the parent or the adults around them. So it's a very one directional relationship for a long time. And you can be close, you can be attuned, you can be loving, you can be celebratory, you can even be friendly with your kid. But expecting your child to be your best friend is a way of elevating them into the role of a pseudo adulthood long before they have the developmental capabilities to do that. And it essentially robs them of the experience of being a child who doesn't have to worry about the world of adults and the worries and the emotional needs of adults. When children are put in that role of having to take care of their parents' needs, and usually this happens very unconsciously, what it does is it basically forces them to skip over parts of their natural development as a child and move away from areas of creativity and spontaneity and the permission to be messy and the permission to have their needs attended to. And they tend to grow up as adults who are very overfunctioning in a lot of ways and underfunctioning in some ways. They're very over attuned to the needs of other people, and this can set them up to be in relationships with abusive partners who exploit that emotional labor. That's essentially what enmeshment is. It's the exploitation of another person's experience to benefit your own. Now, it's not malicious, and I know parents aren't maniacally sitting in the corner like, how can I mess up my kid? But that's what ends up happening when parents don't have enough age appropriate peers with whom to get those needs met. They rely on their kids, and then it becomes this exploitation of their child's development and their identity and their emotional resources.
What does an unhealthy boundary or no boundary look like between a parent and a child?
It can have many different manifestations, but let's maybe start with a little bit of a breakdown because there's different kinds of enmeshment. Parentification is essentially where a child is like tasked with a lot of domestic labor around the home that is beyond their developmental capacity, and is really puts them in kind of a pseudo parent role, especially if they have younger children or younger siblings. So they could be like taking care of their siblings a lot, making meals for them, cleaning the home, being responsible for groceries, or making sure that their younger siblings get to school on time or things like that. That kind of parentification creates a set of responsibilities for children that is sort of beyond what is the scope of what they should be focusing on. And then there's emotional incest, um, covert incest and emotional incest. They're sort of discussed interchangeably. I'll sort of parse them out a little bit, but emotional incest is when there are too few or not secure enough boundaries. And this looks like kind of forgetting where a parent stops and the child starts. So that could look like sharing too much of the parent's stresses with the kids, specific to things like, we can't afford to pay our bills this month, or I'm really worried about your grandparent who is sick. And there's a balance to strike because children should see their parents navigate their own feelings, but when their parents kind of come to them and make it something that they need help from their child to get through, that sort of blurring of the relational boundaries creates a lack of differentiation between the parent and the child. And so it's called emotional incest because essentially our emotional processes should be more separate with between a parent and a child. Again, so that the child doesn't have to take care of the parent and the parent can take care of the child. So that's one way that that can show up. It can also show up in terms of demanding a professional trajectory for your kid or living vicariously through them. I've worked with so many clients whose parents have said, I wanted to be a dancer when I was growing up. And so I didn't have those opportunities. And now you have them. So you should do it. And they really need their child to kind of fulfill an identity path that they didn't get to fulfill in their own lives. So we can see that when parent or their family has a family business, for example, and it's really important to those parents that the children take that over. That might not be what the child wants to do, but it's really important to the parents. So the parents' need supersedes that of the child. And this can happen in lots of ways, like demanding that a child dress a certain way or comport their appearance in a certain way, be friends with certain people because the ego needs of the parent require the child to present in a way that aligns with how they want to see themselves. So it can be really subtle. And it's hard sometimes to differentiate between I want what I think is best for my child or I want what is me, what is best for me for my child. Maybe that's helpful.
Yeah.
But then maybe the last framing is covert incest. And this is where there can be kind of a seductive or a sexual undertone, even though there is no direct physical sexual contact between the parent and the child. And this looks like sharing with the child inappropriate details of a parent's romantic or sexual relationship with their other parent or with other people with whom that parent is involved, or demanding information about your child's sex life or romantic life that is inappropriate. So, wanting to know details of how a sexual experience was for them or how they feel about it. And essentially, like leveling your child up as a surrogate partner for you, right? And that sometimes takes shape and form of like dating your child and taking them on dates or having them buy you flowers for your birthday and kind of creating for them this experience where they should be a partner to you in a way that interrupts their ability to have their own romantic or sexual lives. Children are kind of a captive audience. And when they're scared and when the parents are scared or unsure of how to make sense of what's happening in their lives, I see a lot of parents who are trying to comfort their kids, but they're actually engaging in enmeshed behavior where they're oversharing their experience of what it means to be divorcing their other parent. And it can be really hard because the child then says like, well, this is my other parent, right? I'm half that person too. And they have to decide on who they're going to be loyal to. And this is probably the crux of enmeshment trauma is that as an adult, it creates a lot of loyalty binds. And what that means is that the child has to decide Am I going to be loyal to this parent and this parent's needs or idea of who I am? Or am I going to be loyal to myself and my own authenticity and run the risk of upsetting my parent or even upending the relationship if my parent does not respect my boundaries? Because again, there's this identity, a lack of differentiation or a lack of individuation in identities between an adult child and a parent. And that can show up with partners too. I expect that we are going to be fused in how we see the world. And so when you are different, right, that's intolerable for me. It feels like a rejection of me because we are one, is kind of the unconscious underpinning of that.
Wow, that is fascinating. Yeah. How do adults recognize they're still in enmeshment? If you've been doing it for so long, how do you know it's an issue, and how do you start to take steps to set boundaries?
Yeah, there are so many other ways that this can show up in adult relationships. And sometimes what happens is people start seeing these things and they're going, wow, how come this is so hard for my partner and I, but other people aren't experiencing these kinds of difficulties, right? Other people solve problems differently than we do, or they can solve problems and we can't. Um, so they'll start to notice a contrast between how they do relationship and how other people do relationship. Sometimes it can become painfully obvious to someone who's grown up with an enmeshed parent when they partner with somebody who didn't, and they expect from them a lot of mind reading. So in enmeshment, there's a lot of mind reading. You should know how I feel because there's no differentiation between us. And so for partners in adult relationships, it might be very difficult for them to articulate what they want and need because there's an unconscious expectation that their partner should know that already, because they were expected to know it with their parents and attuned to their parents. So they expect that their partner is going to do that for them. When they go to therapy, people might start hearing the therapist kind of reflect back that something is perhaps not the healthiest way of approaching life or relationships. But a lot of kids grow up recognizing that something feels off, right? Maybe they're trying to individuate in their life and like go launch and be in the world and start a job and move somewhere new, and they're feeling this like pull from their family system, this like refusal to let them be different, because to be different is to threaten the fused identity of the family. So they'll feel this like suction and this like, oh, this suffocation, this almost like engulfment or entrapment that they're very loyal to, because to be disloyal might mean to have to leave the family. And so this is a real tension that a lot of folks can identify once there's a vocabulary for it, and some validation for it. And that begins the very real process of grieving, because for many adult children of enmeshed families, creating new boundaries is the ideal, but the family system is so rigid in its enmeshment that it doesn't really tolerate that. So a lot of adult children find themselves in this position of having to go low contact or no contact with their family in order to feel a sense of liberation in their own authentic identities.
Mm. So when adult children, let's say, try to individuate, what does that actually look like?
Absolutely, like subtle guilt trips. It looks like other family members maybe saying, you can't move because your dad's going to be devastated, right? Or your mom's not going to be okay if you marry that person. It's going to break her heart. That's an enmeshment ploy. That's like somebody pulling you back in and saying, no, 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 no. You have to abandon your interests and what feels good for you in service of this other person, your parent, their needs, because their needs are more important than yours. And this bumps up against a lot of cultural expectations around respecting elders and staying aligned with kind of the currency of how families function, and can be really challenging and complex for people to find their own path in if the family system is so rigid that it doesn't allow for any like malleability There are multiple ways that a parent can be enmeshing, and sometimes those forms are very critical. So the parent can be kind of fused in their identity and be very, very critical of that child. So they might partner then with other folks who are more enmeshed and critical, because it's what they know and it's how they've encoded love and it's what feels familiar, not because they like it or it's good for them. And then there are the versions of enmeshment that look like a lot of idealization of that child. So that child becomes the hero child as opposed to the critically enmeshed child becomes more of a scapegoat. Um, so that hero might look for partners who are going to also idealize them and think they're great and not really hold them accountable for a lot of things. So when that happens, there's a higher risk of people replicating these patterns if they haven't started to do their own work. So when folks start to heal and start to individuate, they're less likely to remain in partnerships that require them to stay enmeshed. But enmeshment is a long unfolding, right? So I've worked with many partners who will find themselves in relationship after relationship after relationship where they end up in these regressed enmeshed dynamics because every time you partner with someone who's also on that journey of healing, it's like new layers become made aware to you. And then it's another grieving process and separation and individuation process. So it can be a long healing. What can happen for a lot of adult enmeshed children who haven't really metabolized and healed through some of this pain yet is they fear being engulfed by their parents, but they're decidedly loyal to them. And when they enter into partnership, the same dynamic can perpetuate. So they enter into it from a place of loyalty and obligation, but they also fear being swallowed up by the needs of their partner. So there can be a lot of like passive aggressive distancing and avoidance. And they can have inappropriate loyalties where they remain loyal to their family of origin and don't fully prioritize their partner as their new attachment person, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it can look like secrecy, right? I don't tell my partner everything about myself because that feels too vulnerable. If I open up and tell them everything, they're either going to reject me or I'll get swallowed up by who they are or by the relationship. Sexually, it can look like being really hot and heavy at the start of a relationship, but the more you emotionally merge and join with someone, the more you get the ick sexually and don't have desire for your partner, especially in dynamics where there was a hint of covert incest or a sexualized enmeshment with their parent. So that can take the shape in what we've talked about, right? A parent giving too many details about their own sex life. It can also look like a parent who walks around naked, or a parent who leaves a lot of pornography around, or a child who hears their parents having sex frequently. There's too much closeness, and that can create this desire to kind of reject even more the idea of anything sexually with people that you share closeness with because it felt so unsafe for those kids growing up. So in romantic partnerships, it can look like desexualizing your partner and losing desire. And for a lot of people, it feels icky. Like that's the word I hear a lot. I get the ick, or it's a disgust, or it's like, oh, right? And when that happens, there's usually some kind of trauma, and it's often a kind of sexual trauma or an enmeshment trauma that is guiding that very strong aversion, because disgust is a gatekeeping emotion, right? It keeps things and people away that we feel are unsafe in some way.
So you mentioned that as a child of an enmeshment, that it really impacts their development, right? What kind of skills or things are they not able to learn as a kid that then they have to like learn as an adult? What's the gap?
I would say one of the biggest gaps is that children who are enmeshed do not have the They don't develop the skills of interoception. So, what that means is the perception of what is internal. They are so overdeveloped in their exteroceptive skills, meaning their perception of what's outside of them, because their parents' needs have superseded their needs. So, children in enmeshed families are really good at tracking their parents and tracking other people, watching for changes in their affect or their behaviors or their expression. They are fixated on what's going on outside of themselves so that they learn what is expected of them and they can pour themselves into the mold of that expectation. That is the adaptive strategy that enmeshed children learn to employ so that they have a chance of getting some of their needs met, right? If they do not capitulate to the needs of their parent, they run the risk of being rejected or punished or ostracized or being shamed. So, children in this context basically learn to self abandon because no one teaches them how to focus on what's going on inside of themselves and how to use that information to set appropriate boundaries for themselves and with other people. So enmeshed children as they get older, again, often go into relationships from a place of being very dutiful. I see what's happening with you, and it's my job to make sure you're okay. Because if you're okay, phew, then maybe I'll be okay too. So their work looks a lot like learning how to go inward and think about what they need and what they want and the difference between those two things, and learning how to say no with self-assurance and with the trust that someone can tolerate their no so that they can really enthusiastically say yes, and to break out of these patterns of being so obligatory in relationships. And when they can do that and move away from this like obligatory, guilt driven, shame driven way of like capitulating to another person, they learn how to be more authentic. And that opens up so much more space for them in their lives to pursue other interests and become creative in different ways and have more vitality. It's soul sucking to be in a relationship with someone where you feel like you are only in service of their needs and it's not mutual or relational. And it is really hard. And when people start doing this work, the pendulum can kind of swing really far in the other direction. And they might be more entitled. They might be less considerate of how they express boundaries because they don't have practice on how to finesse like a way to be relational in boundary setting. So they're afraid to set boundaries because they do often feel like they're an asshole, or they've been told that they're selfish and an asshole by parents who demand that they stay, organized around their needs. So yeah, it's like the hardest part of the work, I think, is to figure out how to say no and say yes while understanding that people can be disappointed and frustrated and angry about your decisions, and that's none of your business.
Right.
Right? Or it's not your job to take away their feelings by changing your yes or your no.
Yes, I was just gonna say if the parent any parents tuning into this are resonating with this, they've recognized, oh, I'm doing some of this and I didn't know it was could be harmful. What could you share with them that can help them going forward? I know, like you said, that this is not malicious.
Have some grace for yourself, right? I think a lot of parents get really defensive when their children bring this up because they don't want to believe that they were not great parents. And many of them were wonderful parents in many ways, but this is a way that maybe they weren't the most attuned to their child. What patriarchy has created, especially in heterosexual relationships, is a dynamic where men are to be divorced from their emotions. And what that means in their adult partnerships is that their wives or their female partners often don't get the support that they need from their male partners, and so they are then more reliant on their children to meet those needs for them, which is why we often see more mother son or mother daughter enmeshment than we do father son or father daughter enmeshment, although those things exist for sure. Um, but it creates this sort of gap in the relational support of both mothers and fathers So they rely on their children in different ways to meet those needs instead of each other, right? Because of the power dynamics that then exist in those marital or partnership relationships. So patriarchy plays a huge role in how our adult relationships and our family structures have been organized. Because in a patriarchy, everything's hierarchical, which means that, nothing can really truly be mutual. And the people who are underneath other people in that hierarchy are in service of supporting the power of the hierarchy. And so it does become this really corrupting and co-opting way of bringing children into this world where the needs are kind of met in an inverse way to what's actually developmentally a healthy way of attending to kids' needs. So hold space for the nuance. You can have been wonderful in some ways, and also some of the things that were adaptive for you may have been hurtful for your children. So when your kids bring it up to you, if they do, um, this is your opportunity to show your kids that you can hold space for their experience without making it about you and how you did the best you could, or you thought you were doing what was right, and all of the ways that parents can try to defend their position. Those sort of defensive remarks serve a good benefit for you in the moment, in the short term, but in the long term, they kind of reinforce the problem with your child, right? Where like their experience is not being heard or witnessed or attuned to. So I think that's maybe the first step. Can you hold space for your child to share with you the impact of this on them, knowing that if your child is saying this to you and they're bringing this to you, it's because they love you and they really want a relationship with you that is thriving and that is vibrant for you both. If your child is bringing this to you, it's a bid for connection. It's them saying, please help me recalibrate this so that we can have the relationship that we both want. A lot of parents feel like they're being threatened, or like their child is kind of saying you're bad. But I just see it as such a different experience. So when parents can kind of like step back from that place and process the feelings that come up for them with a therapist who's trained in this space, oh, that can make such a difference. I've seen so many parent-child relationships heal when parents can take some accountability and say, like, you know what? Shit, I'm sorry. I didn't realize how I was getting my needs met from you, and that wasn't fair to you. That's really what so many kids want to hear. And when they hear something like that, it creates space for them to have compassion for their parent and for renegotiation of the boundaries to be based on who you both are today and what you both need today. So you can actually be the friends that you wanted to believe you were back then.
So glad you tuned into Self-Helpless. If you felt supported by this or past episodes, there are a couple ways you can help the show. Feel free to share it with a friend who may enjoy the variety of discussions we have here. Also, you can become a monthly or annual supporter of the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/selfhelpless. That's where you can pitch and vote on topics, submit questions for special guests, or be a silent supporter and not participate in any of that. 100% of Patreon and merch proceeds go directly to operating expenses that not only keep the show going through thick and thin, but also keeps it accessible to all with minimal ads. If you want to show a little extra leaven, you can leave an Apple Podcast review or send an email to share how Self-Helpless has impacted you. All of this info and more goodies can be found at selfhelplesspodcast.com. All right, love you big time, and thank you so much.